Hey guys, tonight we are going on a journey far, far away from your comfortable bedside lamp and your fully charged phone. Tonight, you are not curled up in a soft blanket, you are trudging through the absolute, soul-consuming blackness of a 19th-century London alley, sometime around 1840. Imagine the air is thick, not just with the usual particulate matter from a million coal fires. The famous, choking-ass London fog that looks like weak grey tea in the daytime, but with the raw, terrifying absence of any light at all. You can feel the cold, slick dampness clinging to your threadbare coat, and you strain your eyes into the void, but the void just pushes back. You probably won't survive this journey without a serious infection, a broken ankle, or a quick interaction with a footpad. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are listening from, and what time it is, and we can all drift off together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on a muddy, cobblestone street, and the sun has just finished its dramatic, smog-choked descent. It is not just dark, it is a historical, pre-electrical-ass physical dark. This darkness is a character in the story, heavy, palpable, and frankly quite rude. It doesn't fade into twilight, it slams the door shut. The thin, wavering light from your own tallow candle lantern, which you clutch tightly, seems less like a useful tool, and more like a glowing advertisement for the people who might wish you ill. It casts a tiny, tremulous bubble of sickly yellow light, and that bubble only seems to make the darkness outside its perimeter denser and more menacing. You take a tentative step. The sound of your boot sinking into the mud is unsettlingly loud. This is the soundtrack of the Victorian night, the sloshing of mud, the distant, muffled clatter of a late, running hackney coach, and the ever-present, low, subterranean roar of a city that never truly sleeps, but merely holds its breath. You are walking down a street that, during the day, is merely chaotic, but now it is an obstacle course designed by a genuinely malicious deity. Think about what is missing. There are no distant street lamps, no car headlights sweeping across a wall, no digital screens emitting blue light from windows. The moon, even if full, struggles valiantly against the perpetual layer of industrial soot clinging to the atmosphere. London, the greatest city in the world at this time, essentially vanishes every night. It folds in on itself, becoming a maze of trip hazards, lurking figures, and open, stinking waterways. Your fear is not abstract. It is built into the very architecture of the city at night. You are acutely aware of the ground beneath your feet. The cobblestones are uneven, polished slick by decades of rain waste and carriage wheels. Suddenly, your foot slips slightly, and you catch yourself. That momentary panic, the stomach, lurching fear of falling, is multiplied 100-fold by the knowledge that a fall here isn't just a scraped knee. You could tumble headfirst into the Laura's Fleet ditch of an open sewer that still, in parts of the city, runs parallel to the streets, carrying everything you can possibly imagine, and a few things you really can't toward the Thames. If you survive the fall, you face a quick and unpleasant death by infectious miasma, or if you're lucky, just drowning in a stew of centuries-old refuse. Historians still argue whether the sheer physical danger of the streets, the open trenches, the heaps of refuse, the missing manhole covers, not that they had proper manholes everywhere yet, contributed more to nighttime anxiety than the fear of human villainy. But honestly, when you're teetering on the edge of a sewage-filled chasm, does it really matter if the hand that pushes you is that of a pickpocket or merely gravity? Let's talk about light, or the criminal lack thereof. You need to get from point A to point B. If you are wealthy, you employ a link boy. These are typically young lads, often orphaned or desperately poor, whose job is to run ahead of you with a flaming torch or a proper oil lantern. They are called link boys because their torches were made of tow and pitch, linking you to safety. Doesn't that sound charmingly quaint? It does until you realize two things. First, the link boy is a flickering, moving target, often exhausted, and the cost of this service is astronomical to a working-class person. Second, the link boy himself might be in league with the very thieves he's meant to be warding off. It's the original delivery guy who might be casing your house dilemma, except the delivery is the promise of not being mugged, and the house is your entire person. Sleepy humor aside, it's a terrifying thought. The only beacon of safety might be a willing accomplice to your downfall. If you cannot afford a link boy, you are navigating by the pathetic, sporadic glow of public lighting. Now, here is a mainstream historical fact for you to tuck away into your sleepy brain. London street lighting evolved slowly, painfully. For a long time, the only official light came from oil lamps here, usually placed at major intersections or outside wealthy residences. These lamps required a nightly, methodical ritual. A lamplighter, a figure you might romanticize, but who was actually just a person with a very tedious, smelly, and slightly dangerous job, had to walk the roads, light the wicks, and then return in the morning to extinguish and refill them. They were often unreliable, prone to sputtering out due to wind or lack of proper fuel, or simply ignored in the city's poorest, most densely populated and crime-ridden corners. The shift to a gaslight, which we will discuss more in a later, equally soothing section, was revolutionary precisely because the oil lamps were so woefully inadequate. An oil lamp might project a useful, albeit weak, light for maybe 20 feet, and then only if the glass was clean and the wick was trimmed. Beyond that small radius, the darkness returned, absolute and unforgiving. So you might have one small, struggling pool of light outside a baker's shop, but the 7-foot gap between that shop and the pawnbroker next door is a yawning pit of potential disaster. Imagine trying to maintain your dignity as you navigate this terrain. You are wearing your best, or perhaps your only decent coat. Every few steps, you hear the skittering, squeaking sound of the horror's rats. They are everywhere, moving with casual confidence because they know this city belongs to them once the sun is down. You can't see them, but you can hear the rustling in the refuse piles and the damp, quick slap of their tiny, horrible feet on the slick stones. You try to suppress the involuntary shudder, but the cold and the fear make it impossible. The thought of stepping on a rat, or worse, having one run across your boot, is a small, visceral terror that compounded the larger dread of the night. The chaos of nighttime movement also contributes to this fear. While the streets are less crowded with pedestrians than during the day, the few that are out are moving fast and unpredictably. The carriage drivers, often half drunk or just numb with exhaustion, careen down the lanes. Their horses' hooves create a thunderous, rhythmic threat that seems to appear out of nowhere. The carriage lights, usually just 2 dim lamps on the side, only illuminate the front of the horse, leaving the enormous, fast-moving vehicle itself shrouded in shadow. You hear the furious clip-clop, you jump back, and you just hope you haven't stumbled into a dark corner where someone else is waiting. A quirky tidbit you might find interesting. Early pedestrian signals were less about lights and more about sound. People used small handbells or even specific rhythmic tapping of their walking stick against the cobblestones to announce their precise, invisible presence. The night was a sonar battlefield where the loudest walker had a tiny, fleeting advantage. And then there is the sound of fast footsteps. The most terrifying sound in 19th-century London is the sound of heavy boots following you. You cannot see the person, so your mind starts to fill in the blanks, which, as you know, is the sleepiest, most terrifying thing the human brain can do. Are they a friend? A drunkard stumbling home? A police constable? Or are they one of these footpads, the highwaymen of the city streets, who will relieve you of your watch, your shilling, and maybe a few teeth? The uncertainty, the inability to verify the source of the noise, drives the anxiety up through the roof of your top hat. You instinctively start to walk faster, but that only makes your breathing louder and your fear more pronounced. You quicken your pace, and they quicken theirs. The darkness becomes a cloak for intent, and the fear is less about what might happen, and more about the absolute certainty that you will not see it coming. This total absence of visual information completely transformed how people felt about leaving their homes after dark. For the working class, nighttime work, dock labor, domestic service, running errands, was essential for survival. Yet, it meant a nightly negotiation with the absolute dark. You learned to walk close to the walls, to avoid the middle of the road where the filth and the fast, moving traffic congregated, and to always have a small, easily disposable item ready to throw in one direction if you were attacked from another. It was a strategy for survival built on anticipation and fear, not sight. The authorities were not much help. The early days of the modern police force are an interesting case study in civic insecurity. Before Sir Robert Peel's 1829 Metropolitan Police Act are a mainstream fact, the city was theoretically protected by parish archers watchmen, the infamous Charlies. These were often elderly, exhausted, and spectacularly ineffective men. They were paid poorly and often supplemented their meager income by being suspiciously absent when trouble was afoot. Their cry, "2 o'clock and all's well," was less a reassurance and more a prompt for opportunistic criminals who knew the old man with the lantern was probably asleep, drunk, or simply hiding. You could, in theory, appeal to the watchman for help, but it was generally accepted that appealing to the darkness itself might be more fruitful. The creation of the laughs, bobbies, or peelers was meant to change all of this. They were a uniformed, professional force designed to be a visible deterrent, but even they struggled against the physical darkness. They wore dark blue, which was meant to mimic the darkness and make them less intimidating than the red-coated soldiers, but it also made them effectively invisible at night. You might see a faint, bobbing light of their lantern far down the street, offering a momentary comfort, only to see it vanish as they turned a corner, leaving you once again to the mercies of the shadows. The transition from the old, sleepy watchman to the new, supposedly vigilant police was uneven, geographically and chronologically. For years, the two systems overlapped, creating a patchwork of security that was mostly threadbare. Imagine the absurdity. You're being chased, you spot a uniformed figure, you sprint toward him for safety, only to realize he's an ancient Charlie who has spent the last hour napping in a barrel and is now quite cross about being disturbed. Your assailant, meanwhile, simply melts back into the three-dimensional blackness where the oil lamp burned out hours ago. The air itself is a constant reminder of the danger. You breathe in the acrid, slightly sweet smell of burning coal, mixed with the stench of human and animal waste. The dampness carries the sounds of the night, amplifying them. A sudden laugh from an upstairs window is startling. A sharp argument from a pub doorway freezes you in your tracks. The darkness doesn't just hide people. It plays tricks with sound, making it impossible to tell if the sound is close or distant, above you or below you. You find yourself turning your head back and forth like a confused owl. trying to triangulate the source of the noise, realizing that whatever it is probably closer than you hope. Even the houses themselves offer little protection. They are tall, narrow, and often packed together, creating deep canyons of shadow between them. If you are walking past a house, the windows, if they have glass, only reflect the faint, scattered light of your own lantern, or they are just solid black rectangles. There is no warmth, no sign of life leaking out into the street. The city retreats into its shell, and the street is left to the elements and the inhabitants of the shadows. As you continue your slow, fearful walk, you realize that the fear of the physical dark is fundamentally the fear of the far as unverifiable. During the day, you can catalog the threats. You can see the suspicious character leaning against the wall, the unstable pile of bricks, the stray dog. At night, every shape is a question mark. That pile of sacks could be an innocent delivery, or it could be a crouching figure waiting to spring. That low, scraping sound could be a loose slate, or a knife being drawn slowly across stone. Your own imagination, deprived of light, becomes your greatest tormentor. You start to see movement where there is none, hear whispers on the wind. It is exhausting. The sheer mental effort required to navigate this physical dark is draining. You must be hyper-vigilant, every muscle tense, every sense operating at a painful peak. You can't relax for a second, because a second is all it takes for the cobblestones to trip you up, for the traffic to overwhelm you, or for the silent threat to materialize from the deeper, thicker shadows of a covered entryway. This constant state of low-grade, visual deprivation anxiety is the true terror of the 19th-century night. You long for the moment you can reach the thin, comforting light spilling from your own keyhole, a light that, by comparison to the abyssal street, feels like the warmth of 1,000 suns. The darkness is not just an inconvenience, it is a social divider. The rich could retreat behind thick walls, iron gates, and servants carrying bright lamps inside their carriages. The poor, however, lived their lives, their work, their commutes, their brief moments of illicit recreation, entirely within the dominion of the dark. Their entire neighborhood, which was barely illuminated during the day, became a three-dimensional labyrinth of shadows and unknown threats after sunset. This is why the fear of the dark was so pervasive. It was a fear that the entire world had been turned against you, that the very fabric of the environment was designed to swallow you whole. And it was cold, not just the physical temperature, but the psychological cold of isolation. The noise of the city is a comfort during the day because it means people are nearby, ready to bear witness. At night, even with the residual background noise, you feel profoundly alone. If you were to cry out, who would hear you? A window might open above, but the listener would be too fearful to descend the stairs and face the street. The darkness is a pact of mutual non-intervention, a tacit agreement among the city's inhabitants that once the lamps go out, everyone is on their own. You are moving slower now, your eyelids heavy with the concentration of sightless travel. You've successfully avoided the muddiest patch and navigated a dangerous crossing where a cab just missed you by inches, the startled horse snorting hotly in the black air. You wipe a bead of sweat from your forehead, a ridiculous sensation given the chill in the air. The physical dark is relentless. It allows for no errors. One misstep, one moment of distraction, and you are either in a sewer or in the hands of someone who has been waiting patiently, knowing that sooner or later, someone just like you would come shuffling down their street. This omnipresent, low-frequency terror is what makes the 19th-century night so different from our own brightly lit, satellite-mapped, and generally predictable world. The great, literal blackness was the first, most constant, and most tangible enemy of the Victorian Londoner. You yearn for the invention of the cheap, reliable match, or better yet, the incandescent bulb. But those comforts are centuries away, and you must simply trudge on through the thick, terrifying, all-consuming, physical dark. You are still shuffling forward, your lantern casting that faint, pathetic circle of light, but now the fear begins to mutate. It is no longer just the fear of falling into an unseen ditch or tripping over unseen debris. Now, the darkness is less about the physical environment and more about the invisible, rising threat of others' human intent. This is the other's criminal dark, a specific dread born from the Victorian realization that civilization's great advantage, anonymity, was also its greatest flaw. London, the colossal heart of an empire, was a city of millions, and in that crowd, predators moved with terrifying confidence. Remember that unsettling sound of footsteps behind you. They haven't stopped. You risk a glance over your shoulder, a rapid, frantic flick of your head, but the lantern's beam is too weak. It throws back shadows that are deep, flickering, and entirely unhelpful. Your mind races. Are there two figures? Three. Are they carrying a philosopher's bludgeon, a weighted stick of wood used to silently knock victims unconscious? Or are they armed with a knife, ready for the swift, brutal robbery known locally as being turned out? The anticipation is truly worse than the event itself, although the event is certainly no picnic. This section, My Sleepy Friend, is dedicated to the figures who owned the 19th century night. We are talking about the pickpockets, yes, but more importantly, the organized gangs, the specialized thugs, and the sheer audacity of criminals who knew the city's dark corners better than any police constable. The physical dark provided cover, but the criminal dark provided motive and opportunity. Let's focus on the footpads again, because they were the immediate, localized terror. These were the urban equivalent of the highwaymen, only instead of operating on desolate stretches of road, they worked the most densely populated, yet poorly lit, parts of the city. Their methods were direct, brutal confrontation, often 2 or 3 against 1, relying on shock and speed. You would be walking along, congratulating yourself on surviving the last few blocks, when a hand clamps over your mouth, and another rips your watch chain from your waistcoat. Your cry for help is swallowed instantly by the surrounding noise. The distant factory whistle, the rattling of a cart, the perpetual low hum of the city's millions. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the rise of the organized criminal element in the early 19th century was directly tied to the massive and rapid increase in London's population. What historians call the others, Great Migration. People poured into the city seeking work, but when work failed, or when wages were too low, crime became a viable, if perilous, career path. The population explosion simply diluted the ability of the existing institutions, the ineffective old watchmen, the new police, to maintain any sort of comprehensive control over the streets, especially after dark. But the footpad wasn't the only threat lurking in the blackness. You also had to worry about the body snatchers, or as resurrectionists. Here's a quirky tidbit to keep you awake. Just barely medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy lessons, and legally obtained bodies were scarce and expensive. This created a horrific subterranean economy. Unscrupulous individuals would exhume recently buried corpses from inadequately secured churchyards and sell them to surgeons. The darkness was their friend. They worked silently under the cover of night, digging up graves, often within days of the burial. Your fear wasn't just for your own safety, but for the safety of your recently departed loved ones. You worried that their body, only just laid to rest, would be brutally disinterred, carted across the city, and dissected for a few pounds sterling. This specific, ghoulish anxiety drove people to install mortifice, heavy iron cages or stone slabs over fresh graves, a visible, metallic testament to the psychological terror that the night carried. The darkness literally became the cloak for violating the ultimate sanctity, the sleep of the dead. The police were aware of these specialized nocturnal threats, but their resources were stretched impossibly thin. The averages beat copper, our friendly bobbies, was expected to cover a vast distance in the dark, often alone. They worked in pairs only in the most notorious areas. Try to picture it: a solitary man in a dark blue coat, holding a small lantern, patrolling streets where a dozen desperate men could emerge from a shadowed alleyway in seconds. Their visibility was supposed to be the deterrent, but at night, their visibility was almost zero. It was like sending a single, mildly confused lighthouse keeper out to patrol the entire Atlantic coastline. Historians still argue whether the Victorian press sensationalized crime stories to such an extent that the perception of danger was worse than the reality. Newspapers loved stories of daring robberies and murders, often emphasizing the gloom and terror of the scene. However, for you, walking alone down a street like the infamous Wapping Old Stairs, or the alleys around Rookery of St. Galicia, the fear is very real, regardless of whether the daily paper exaggerated the total statistics. Let's talk briefly about the architecture of crime. London was full of ancient, labyrinthine structures. Tenement blocks built around narrow courts, warrens of back-to-back houses and twisting, intersecting alleyways designed centuries ago. These areas, often referred to as slums or rookeries, were perfect criminal habitats. The police, the authority figures of the day, dared not venture deep into these areas at night, or if they did so in force. For the common person, walking near a rookery after sunset was an act of profound, almost suicidal bravery. You could be pulled into a doorway, dragged down a cellar staircase, or simply vanish forever, all within a few feet of a major thoroughfare. The darkness provided the crucial 5 seconds needed for the crime to be executed, and for the criminal to disappear back into the tangled maze of the city's forgotten spaces. Remember that feeling of being completely alone, even though you know millions of people surround you. This isolation was deliberately exploited. Criminals relied on the fact that witnesses were unlikely to step forward, partially out of fear of retribution and partially because of the general Victorian ethos of mind your own business. You may hear a muffled cry for help, but your instinct, honed by years of surviving the urban night, tells you to quicken your pace and pretend you heard nothing. You are a prisoner of silence, afraid to draw attention to yourself by acknowledging the violence happening just meters away. You might even encounter the more organized, subtle form of criminal activity, the VR's extortionists and the R's confidence men who worked in the liminal spaces of the night. You're walking past a pub, and a figure emerges from the deep shadow of the door jamb. He doesn't immediately attack you. Instead, he speaks in a low, conspiratorial voice. Deal, a tip, or an investment opportunity that is too good to be true. He is relying on your sense of disorientation and your fear of the immediate threat. He knows that in the dark, you are desperate to resolve the situation quickly and quietly, often leading you to hand over a small amount of money, just to make him melt back into the shadows. This interaction is less physically violent, but equally sinister, playing on the knowledge that the darkness makes people susceptible to quick, fear-driven decisions. The police tried, of course, to combat this rising tide of nighttime criminality. They developed strategies, such as plainclothes officers, but the lack of good lighting was their perpetual nemesis. They couldn't adequately observe, they couldn't pursue effectively, and they couldn't secure a scene. Imagine trying to identify a suspect who attacked you when the light source was a single, sputtering oil lamp 50 yards away. All you might remember is a quick, dark shape and a rough voice. This situation was made even worse by the prevalence of thieves, flash houses, pubs and taverns that were known haunts for criminals, often providing them with information about potential victims or safe places to hide stolen goods. These establishments, especially in dockside areas, were hives of activity after dark. They might appear slightly more illuminated than the street outside, but the light was often dim, smoky, and unreliable, creating an environment where a quick shift in personnel or the exchange of illegal goods could happen seamlessly. You would walk past one of these places and feel a wave of tension, knowing that behind those grimy, closed doors, plots were being hatched for the very night you were walking. As your feet crunch on a patch of loose gravel, you clutch your wallet deeper inside your coat. You remember the terrifying stories, the attacks on lonely postmen, the robberies of jewelry from sleeping residents near the docks, the vanishing of unsuspecting sailors. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, cemented the idea that the night was owned by the predator. It was a time when the moral and legal order of the city dissolved, leaving only the brutal law of the jungle. The criminal dark was not just about the fear of being mugged. It was a deeper fear about the wire's dissolution of society itself. The darkness allowed the worst elements of the population to operate unchecked, eroding the very sense of security that a prosperous, supposedly civilized city was meant to provide. You feared the chaos, the sudden sharp violence, and the realization that in the deep, enveloping black, no one would come to save you. It's a strange thing, this fear. You can handle the idea of a disease. We'll get to that in the next sleepy segment, because a disease is a faceless, impersonal enemy. But the fear of the criminal dark is personal. It is the fear of being chosen, of being targeted by another human being who sees your vulnerability, your isolation, and the cover of the night as an irresistible invitation. You realize the true terror is the silent, calculated malice that accompanies a thief's footsteps that now, thankfully, seem to be fading slightly behind you. Perhaps they decided you weren't worth the risk, or perhaps they simply turned down another, darker alley. Either way, for this moment, you are safe, but the psychological residue of the criminal dark clings to you, making every passing shadow a suspect, and every sudden noise a potential attack. You are learning to breathe again, slowly, deliberately, focusing on the rhythmic swing of your oil lamp and the welcome sound of your own, solitary movements. The relief is palpable, but you know this dark truce is only temporary. You've survived the physical pitfalls and the immediate threat of the footpads, but the darkness now shifts its focus, becoming something insidious, something you can breathe in. This is the Edris medical darky, the profound fear of unseen contagion, and the terrifying lack of medical understanding that plagued 19th-century Londoners, especially after sunset. The air itself is your enemy. Remember how thick it was. It's not just coal dust. It is believed to be saturated with miasma. This is a mainstream historical fact that governed everything from public health policy to personal anxiety. Victorians widely believed that disease, particularly the most terrifying killers like cholera and typhus, was spread not by invisible germs, a theory still gaining traction, but by foul-smelling, putrid air. This bad air, rising from stagnant water, open sewers, and decaying organic matter, was thought to be heaviest and most potent when the cold, damp darkness descended. Imagine the smell as you continue your slow, cautious walk. It is a complex, revolting perfume, the sharp ammonia of horse urine, the cloying sweetness of rot from a poorly sealed privy, the metallic stench of the Thames at low tide, and the pervasive, sulphurous whiff of coal smoke. These smells, which were merely unpleasant during the day, become terrifying signals at night. Every deep breath you take is an act of potential self-poisoning. You pull your scarf or handkerchief up over your mouth, a futile gesture against the microscopic enemy, but a necessary psychological defense against the perceived miasma. The darkness allowed the source of this, bad air, to flourish unchecked. During the day, you might see a burst sewage pipe or a pile of decaying fish near the market, providing a visible target for complaint or repair. At night, these sources become invisible and anonymous. The open sewers, those lethal ditches you've been trying to avoid, simply release their poisonous effluvia into the cold air without visible interruption. The miasma theory meant that the dark was not just a place where criminals lurked, it was a vast, open-air gas chamber, activated every evening. The fear of cholera was particularly acute and tied deeply to the night, when an epidemic struck. And there were several devastating ones throughout the century. The fear was total. Cholera moved with frightening speed, often killing a victim within 24 hours of the first symptoms. It started with severe vomiting and diarrhea, leading to dehydration, shock, and a terrifying blue-gray pallor. You feared going to bed perfectly healthy and waking up in the throes of a fatal illness. The night, the time of supposed rest and recovery, became the time of deadly exposure. When a neighbor's window remained dark or a cough was heard across the courtyard, the anxiety immediately ratcheted up. Here's a quirky tidbit about public health responses during the worst cholera outbreaks. Many people believed the disease was a visitation or a moral judgment, but the practical response was often based on the miasma theory. Authorities sometimes paid people to walk the streets at night, setting off small tar barrels or braziers, hoping that the stronger, sharper smell of the burning tar would somehow purify or neutralize the pervasive, bad air of the disease. So, in the middle of a frighteningly dark and silent night, you might suddenly encounter a figure walking toward you, trailing a plume of stinging smoke, less like a protective presence and more like a bizarre, ancient shaman. The medical infrastructure of the city was, for much of the 19th century, catastrophically ill-equipped to deal with the night. Hospitals were places of last resort, often associated with infection and death, rather than cure. The journey to a hospital at night was fraught with danger. Bumpy, dark roads, the risk of falling from the carriage, and the ever-present threat of robbery. If you or a loved one fell ill after dark, you were largely reliant on the immediate, often inadequate, care provided by a family member or a local apothecary. There was no widespread, reliable ambulance service, no brightly lit, sterile emergency room. Illness in the dark felt final and isolating. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of nighttime fatalities during epidemics was due more to the delay in seeking aid, because of the darkness and danger, or to the cyclical nature of certain fevers that peaked after sundown. Regardless, the outcome was the same. The night was associated with the final, grim stages of disease. Think about the psychological impact of being sick in the dark. You are shivering with fever, sweat, soaked, and confused. The only light is a single candle, casting vast, dancing shadows on the wall, turning every common object into a monstrous shape. The sound of the night, the howling wind, the clatter of a coach, the distant, inexplicable cry, is amplified by your heightened senses. You are suffering not just from the disease, but from the terrifying spectacle of your own illness, played out in the oppressive gloom. The fear also extended to the medical professionals themselves. A doctor called out in the middle of the night, often for a birth, a fever, or a sudden accident, faced the same dangers as anyone else. He had to navigate the unlit, dangerous streets, often carrying his medical bag, a potential target for thieves who knew the bag might contain not just instruments, but also money paid by patients. The darkness essentially penalized the delivery of necessary medical care, contributing to the general feeling that the city's infrastructure failed catastrophically after sunset. Even simple daily routines became sources of fear in the medical dark. Take the act of getting water. The city's water supply was notoriously contaminated, often drawn directly from the highly polluted Thames River or from wells adjacent to overflowing cesspits. The risk of contamination was constant. You might be filling your jug from a communal pump in the street, an act necessary for survival, but performed in the frightening gloom. You can't see the dirt, the particulate matter, or the potential effluents that might be contaminating the pump handle or the water itself. You simply have to trust that the water is safe, a trust that the history of Victorian London repeatedly proved to be misplaced. The constant dampness of the London climate, especially at night, contributed to the fear of consumption, tuberculosis. The cold, damp air that seemed to press in on the city after dark was believed to exacerbate respiratory illnesses. People would huddle close to their inadequate coal fires, terrified that the damp chill creeping in through the cracks in the walls would be the trigger for a fatal decline. The darkness and the cold were seen as co-conspirators in the slow, agonizing death that consumption represented. The sight of a neighbor struggling with a cough at night was not just a pity. It was a terrifying prognosis of your own potential future. The darkness also concealed the city's profound sanitation crisis. We talked about the Fleet Ditch, but remember the sheer volume of human and animal waste that existed. It was mostly dealt with by the night soil men, individuals whose grim job was to empty the cesspools and privies. They worked exclusively under the cover of darkness. The stench of their work was unavoidable and overwhelming, clinging to the night air. While they were performing a necessary service, the very presence of this activity, the dredging up of human waste in the blackest hours, only reinforced the idea that the night was the time of foulness, of dangerous putrefaction, and of the raw, unsanitized reality of urban life. The darkness was literally covering up the city's worst health problems. You stumble slightly over a loose flagstone, and the momentary lapse in control brings you back to the present. You can hear a deep, rasping cough from a window high above you. Is it the ordinary fatigue of a worker, or is it the telltale sign of a deadly fever taking hold? You instinctively hold your breath for a moment, waiting for the air to feel less heavy, less infected. The medical dark was perhaps the most inescapable fear, because it was existential. You could try to avoid the footpad by staying home, but you couldn't avoid the air you breathed or the water you drank. The darkness intensified these risks by concealing their sources and amplifying the sense of vulnerability. It was the time when the invisible forces of nature, the germs if you were a forward, thinking scientist, or the miasma if you were everyone else, held undisputed sway. You prayed for the first light of dawn, not just for the hope of visibility, but for the presumed purification of the air by the sun's rays. The ultimate terror of the medical dark was the lack of control. Unlike a robbery, which you might theoretically fight off, disease felt inevitable. Your only defense was preventative, often based on guesswork and superstition. Wearing amulets, burning strong-smelling herbs, or simply closing your windows tight against the night air. These desperate, futile measures taken against an unseen, odorlessly, despite the miasma theory, enemy only reinforced the deep, anxious realization that your survival was less a matter of vigilance and more a roll of the dice in the overwhelming, disease-ridden blackness. You've survived the physical dangers, the criminal threats, and the invisible contagion of the night. Now, we turn our attention to the one thing that promised to conquer the darkness but, in its chaotic, halting rollout, often made the fear worse, the DOS infrastructural dark. This is the story of gaslight, the revolutionary technology that was meant to banish the blackness, but instead created a psychological landscape of unreliable illumination and new forms of urban anxiety. You are still walking, the fear now mixed with a wary resignation. Then you see it, a single, glowing orb down the street, casting a harsh, theatrical white light that makes the yellow flicker of your own oil lamp seem pitiful. This is the new world, the promise of the Victorian age. Ara's gas lamp. The mainstream historical fact here is that London was the very first city in the world to be widely lit by gas. Pall Mall area first saw public gas lighting in 1807, and the Ayres Gas Light and Coke Company was established in 1812. This was a monumental shift. Gaslight was infinitely brighter and more consistent than the old oil lamps. It was hailed as the great civilizer, the technological solution to crime and fear. It was supposed to create a perpetually daylit city. But for decades, this reality was a patchy, unreliable, and frankly, terrifying mess. The infrastructural dark stems from the agonizingly slow and uneven installation process. Gas companies prioritized the wealthiest, most prominent areas, the West End, the major thoroughfares, the governmental buildings. This left the vast majority of working-class neighborhoods, the intricate mazes of back alleys and slums, literally in the dark for generations. The city's geography was therefore split into zones of safety and zones of danger, defined purely by illumination. You might walk a block in brilliant, steady gaslight, feeling a momentary rush of relief, only to turn a corner and plunge back into the absolute blackness of an oil lamp area, or worse, an area with no lighting at all. This stark contrast was psychologically jarring. The sudden return to the void felt more menacing after experiencing the seductive promise of the light. The darkness wasn't just there. It was specifically denying you. A key part of this anxiety was the sheer unreliability of the early systems. Gas was dangerous. The pipes were often leaky, and the technology for controlling the flow and pressure was rudimentary. This meant the gas lamps were prone to dramatic failures. You'd be walking under a comforting line of bright, hissing lamps, and then, without warning, the pressure would drop. The flames would shrink to a dim blue flicker, or they would simply whoosh out entirely, plunging an entire street into immediate, total darkness. Imagine the sudden, sharp shock of this. One moment you're safe, your eyes adjusted to the bright light. The next you are blind, disoriented, and absolutely certain that someone waiting in the shadows has just seen their opportunity. The fear wasn't just the dark returning, it was the acres chaos of a powerful, modern system failing you. The light, which promised civilization, delivered only a sense of technological betrayal. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. The new, bright gaslight created a whole new kind of fear. The fear of being too visible. The old dark was a place of universal anonymity. Everyone was hidden. The new light was an interrogation. Footpads and thieves learned to avoid the bright, central streets. They retreated to the dark borderlands, the periphery where the gaslight petered out, and they watched their victims travel from the bright area into the dark. The gaslight became a spotlight, drawing attention to you right before you entered the danger zone. You were literally walking from a place of public view into a sniper's nest. The lamplighters, the men responsible for maintaining this complex, subterranean network, took on a new, pivotal role. They were no longer just lighting an oil wick. They were tending to a vast, temperamental machine. Their presence, moving slowly through the city, operating the brass valves, and igniting the great globes, was a visual reassurance. When the lamplighter was late, or when a series of lamps remained stubbornly unlit, the anxiety was immediate and communal. The darkness wasn't accidental. It felt like a deliberate administrative failure, a sign that the civil authority had forgotten your street. Historians still argue whether the new gaslight actually decreased overall street crime or merely shifted it to the unlit areas and inside homes. While statistics suggest certain types of street violence dropped in well-lit areas, the psychological effect was that the criminal element was simply pushed closer to your doorstep, lurking where the light was still too expensive to reach. The city's infrastructure also became a physical symbol of the class divide at night. The gleaming light of vast Regent Street was a clear message. This is where the money is, and this is where the security is guaranteed. The pitch-black, narrow lanes of the 7 dials sent the opposite message. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. For the working-class person commuting home late, the darkness was not merely an absence of photons. It was a physical manifestation of their low status, a lack of investment in their safety and well-being. The infrastructural dark reinforced the idea that if you were poor, you were not entitled to security after sunset. The very average noises of the gaslight was unnerving. Unlike the quiet sputter of an oil lamp, the gas burners made a distinct, continuous tree-hissing sound, the sound of pressurized fuel being aggressively burned, while comforting in its regularity. The sudden absence of that hiss meant trouble. You would instinctively listen for the hiss, and if it stopped, you knew the light was out and you were now exposed. It was a soundtrack of perpetual, low-level technical anxiety. Furthermore, the new light changed how you saw the interior of the darkness. When the only light was a small candle, the shadows were soft, immense, and encompassing. The gaslight, being much brighter, created shadows that were sharp, black, and deeply defined. A figure standing 10 feet away from a gas column would be a stark, two-dimensional silhouette, robbing them of detail, making them seem more menacing, less human. The light didn't just illuminate, it actively distorted, creating a new, uncanny landscape of sharp contrasts that played tricks on the anxious mind. The infrastructural dark was also tied to the city's vast network of subterranean pipes and mains. You walked over a hidden web of explosive potential. Leaks were common, and explosions were a frightening, if sporadic, reality. You feared that a sudden rush of gas might pool in an alleyway or a poorly ventilated cellar, waiting for a spark. The night was when these unseen, structural flaws felt most threatening, most likely to erupt without warning. The technology that promised safety was itself a hidden, volatile threat beneath your feet. As you near the end of this stretch, you can see a cluster of gas lamps ahead, perhaps marking a major junction. The sudden feeling of relative safety is overwhelming, almost intoxicating. But you are also acutely aware that just beyond the reach of those bright, hissing globes, the primordial, absolute darkness reigns supreme. The lesson of the infrastructural dark is this: technology is fragile, and the promise of perpetual light is a lie. The darkness is always waiting, and sometimes the light only serves to define its terrifying boundaries more sharply. You move quickly through the illuminated patch, keen to avoid loitering in the brightly lit showcase area. You know that to the Victorians, the light itself could feel like a temporary, costly gift that could be revoked at any moment, plunging the soul back into the chaos it had momentarily fled. The gaslight did not eliminate the fear of the dark. It merely reframed it as the fear of Vive's technological collapses. and I, social iniquity, two deeply Victorian anxieties. You have navigated the external terrors, the physical blackness, the human malice, the unseen diseases, and the failing infrastructure. Now you stand at the threshold of the final and most profound darkness, the Cæsar's psychological darks. This is the internalized fear, the swirling anxieties, the superstitions, and the deep, unsettling Victorian preoccupation with the lyra's uncanny that the absence of light brought to the surface. You are exhausted. Your tense muscles ache from hours of hyper-vigilance, and your mind is a wary landscape of half-seen threats. The darkness has not just threatened your body and purse, it has fundamentally challenged your sanity. The Victorian era, for all its scientific and imperial confidence, was also deeply spiritual, often morbid, and profoundly concerned with things that lay just beyond the veil of rational understanding. The night was when that veil became thinnest. One of the most defining aspects of this psychological dark was the fear of the law's supernatural. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw a massive surge in interest in spiritualism and the occult. Seances were fashionable, and people genuinely believed that the spirits of the dead could communicate. The darkness was the optimal condition for these activities. In the unlit parlor or the foggy street, the imagination, deprived of empirical data, was ready to believe anything. You feared not just the living criminal, but the hour's unquiet dead. The darkness was the domain of ghosts, poltergeists, and spectral figures who had unfinished business. Think back to the body snatchers we mentioned. The terror of the resurrectionists was not just the physical violation of the grave, it was the spiritual anxiety that a restless, disturbed soul might follow its violated body back into the world, seeking vengeance. When you heard a scratching sound outside your window at night, your mind was quick to jump past branch, or rat straight to wraith, or vengeful spirit. This leads us to a quirky tidbit about Victorian culture, the widespread terror of the Vasra's unknown woman, or the Das Nachtmeister. Many urban legends circulated about a ghostly female figure who walked the darkened, cobbled streets, either luring men to their doom or appearing as a terrifying omen of death. She was often associated with fog and the poorest, least lit areas of the city. These stories were partly a reflection of anxieties about female independence and morality, but they were also a direct psychological projection of the city's inability to police itself. The darkness allowed the city's unresolved fears about gender, morality, and social order to take on a terrifying, personified shape. The psychological dark also intensified the fear of ours isolation. Victorian life was highly communal, but the darkness was a forced, profound solitude. If you were home alone, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind down the chimney, became a momentous event. Your small candle only illuminated a tiny portion of the room, leaving the corners vast, deep, and menacing. This is the Tsar's uncanny at work, the familiar domestic space becoming suddenly strange and threatening. You knew the house, but the darkness made it alien. You felt watched, not by a person, but by the house itself. The sudden shift from the crowded, noisy, visible daytime world to the silent, invisible night was a profound shock to the nervous system. Historians still argue whether the Victorian fascination with mystery novels and Gothic horror, stories like those by Edgar Allan Poe, which played heavily on psychological terror and claustrophobia, was a cause or a symptom of the intense nighttime anxiety prevalent in the period. It's likely they fed one another, the fictional terrors amplifying the real-world dread of the dark. The terror of their insomnia was also a major part of the psychological dark. For those suffering from the disease of the night, the darkness was not a refuge, but a prison. You would lie awake, listening to the horrifying sounds of the night, the distant, drunken singing, the clop of the last cab, the rhythmic, unsettling sound of the night watchman's staff tapping the stones. Unable to sleep, your mind would inevitably turn to the three preceding darks: the lurking criminal, the creeping disease, the structural failure. The inability to escape the anxieties of the day through the simple mechanism of sleep made the night a form of mental torture. Remember the fear of the failing gaslight. That was just the external manifestation of the deepest Victorian psychological fear, the loss of the founder's order. The British Empire prided itself on its structure, its rationality, and its control. The night, the total, primitive blackness, represented the complete breakdown of that control. It was the return to a chaotic, pre-civilized state where authority vanished, boundaries dissolved, and rational thought was supplanted by primal fear. Every time the light failed, it wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It was a philosophical statement that the forces of chaos were winning. The darkness also amplified the existing feelings of guilt and shame. If you had committed some moral transgression, however small, the night was when your conscience truly tormented you. With no external distractions, you were forced to confront your inner demons. The shadows in the corner were not necessarily ghosts, but the visual representation of your own unacknowledged sins. The night was the time of reckoning, a cold, silent confessional where the only priest was your own terrified mind. You finally reach the door of your lodgings. You fumble with the large, heavy brass key. The silence of the alley pressing in on you. The mechanical difficulty of finding the lock in the dark, the small, fumbling motions, adds a final, frustrating layer to the night's terror. You fear the key will drop, or that your fumbling movements will attract the attention of a lingering threat. When the lock finally turns with a satisfying, metallic thud, it is the sound of our civilization returning. You close the door quickly, leaning back against the cold wood, your chest heaving. You are safe, for now. But the psychological dark has followed you inside. You light a small candle. The light is weak, but it is yours. You look around your small room, trying to re-establish the familiar contours of your world. But the fear remains, a residue of the night's journey. You realize that the fear of the 19th century dark was a complete, immersive experience, a fusion of physical danger, social anxiety, medical terror, and deep-seated psychological dread. The darkness was not just an environmental factor. It was a cultural force that shaped the Victorian mind. And now, as you place your lamp on a small wooden table, your journey through the deepest, blackest hours of London's past is nearly complete. You survived the physical perils, outran the criminal intent, avoided the invisible miasma, and endured the technological failures. You have faced the psychological reality that when the light goes out, humanity is returned to its most primitive, most anxious state. The 19th century Londoner was afraid of the dark, because the dark was where all the problems of their burgeoning, overcrowded, industrial city collected, magnified, and waited in silent, predatory stillness. The candle flickers, its small flame casting a gentle, tired glow. The night is still out there, pressing against the window pane. But here, in your small, illuminated bubble, a temporary peace descends. The fear now begins to recede, a tide pulling back from a quiet shore. The frantic pulse slows, and the tension melts from your shoulders. You are no longer on the slick, perilous cobblestones, but safe within the comforting, familiar walls of your own mind. The darkness outside your window is simply the rest of the world sleeping, no longer a domain of terror, but a vast, silent ocean of calm. Let the worries of the past, the rough sound of the footsteps, the distant, frantic cough, the sputtering hiss of the failing gas lamp, fade into the background hum of the night. Feel the gentle warmth of your breath, the soft, rhythmic beating of your heart. The city's anxieties are not yours to carry anymore. They are merely stories, echoes from a time long ago, carefully wrapped in the velvet silence of the late hour. Allow yourself to be heavy, to sink deeper into the comfort beneath you. The shadows in your room are friendly now, soft and indistinct. They offer rest, not threat. Breathe in slowly a deep, cleansing breath and release all tension with a slow sigh. The journey is over. The darkness is kind. Let it be the quiet blanket that settles over your weary mind. Sleep now, deeply and soundly, until the sun rises to greet you.